We had Brian Godawa on the show at the end of last year to talk about the hero's journey and the monomyth. Many of you sent us messages saying how fascinated you were by the ideas that Brian shared, specifically about the supernatural worldview of the Bible. Well, in the immortal words of Lando Calrissian, buckle up, baby. Brian is back. This is Tatooine Sons.
It's true. All of it.
What is the name of the porg on the Millennium Falcon?
Force is strong in my family.
What do you think his name is? It's a big moment.
I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
Maybe Turbis?
Do or do not. There is no try.
Turbis? Pablo, if you're listening to this live stream, that porg's name is now Turbis. It's a good Star Wars name.
We're not done yet.
These guys recorded an awesome podcast called Tatooine Sons. Everybody was
Welcome to Tatooine Sons, the only fan podcast to name an official Star Wars creature and to be endorsed by the writer-director of The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson. We believe that pop culture is the mythology of this generation and that there is a story written on our souls. These myths speak to that story, and that is why I am honored to be joined again this week by Brian Godawa. Brian Godawa has been a professional writer and a filmmaker for over 15 years. As an award-winning screenwriter, his first feature film was To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland. But his skills and experience quickly expanded to include writing and directing feature films, documentaries, and video promotionals. His popular book, Hollywood Worldviews, Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment, is used as a textbook in schools around the country. He is a contributing writer to various journals and professional organizations, and his articles on movies and philosophy have been published around the world. His Chronicles series of novels are his most important contribution by incarnating his worldview and theology in narrative, unlike anything that you've read before. I asked the question that I've most often wondered about Brian. How does a Hollywood screenwriter suddenly become an author of books about watchers and Nephilim and ancient biblical mythology?
Yeah, well, I started out trying to write a movie. Back in 2010, I wrote a Noah Primeval was the name of the movie. And that's where I kind of discovered, I was doing research for that script, and that's where I discovered the Watchers and the Giants, Nephilim, and all that stuff. And I discovered Michael Heiser's work, which blew my mind and opened up the doors. And I thought this is going to be a cool movie. And then I wrote the script, and I found out Darren Aronofsky was making his movie. So I thought, well, how can I beat him to the punch? And I'm not going to be able to make a movie. He's going to get it made, because I was a nobody. But I realized, well, I guess I need to novelize it and put it in a novel. And sure enough, I got out a year before the movie anyway. But that process is what it was what opened the door for me to be able to incorporate this theological thread that I discovered in the Bible into a story that I also was entertaining, and it began with that. And now I've written, I don't know, 15, 16 novels later. I'm still incorporating that. I'm retelling Bible stories with this, what I call the Watcher paradigm, which includes giants, but the Watcher paradigm is more this concept that there are Watchers, like Daniel 4 and Daniel 9 or 8, where there are princes over nations, spiritual principalities and powers, like Paul wrote, and they are over the earthly principalities and authorities. So a king or a nation or a major city might have a spiritual power over it, so that when there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven, or something like that. And so thus you have the prince of Greece and the prince of Persia fighting in Daniel 8,
Mhm.
Is it 10? I've got look
I
that
think
up while I'm
it's 10 for
yakking.
Dan. Yeah, that's
Because
all right.
I've been.
That's okay. Nobody reads the Old Testament anyway, so it doesn't matter. You can just make it up. So,
but by now, I've been doing this for years. I should be able to just reference that. Oh, Daniel, whatever. Daniel 4 for the Watchers, and the princes is Daniel 8, maybe. Anyway, look it up, people. Do your own research. Anyhow, that was this notion, and it's an ancient notion. It's in the Bible as well, and there's plenty of verses about it. But the concept is basically that there are spiritual principalities and powers over Gentile nations. Specifically in the Bible, it was, God said, in Deuteronomy 32 that they're going to be allotted. The Gentile nations would be allotted to these fallen sons of God creatures, and anyway, so the unique proposition that I kind of brought to the game was I discovered Michael Heiser's work, and he's an evangelical theologian who's very he believes the Bible, so it's not he's not a liberal, but he also believes we should interpret the Bible within its original ancient Near Eastern context and stop imposing our modern one on it. And that, now I already understood that in my own life with eschatology and such, but when he applied that to these other texts, it blew my mind, it opened me up, and I realized there's so much there in the Bible that we're missing because we're imposing our own modern view. And this concept of these territorial powers and stuff is like wild. I'm like, it's hard for me to believe because I tend to be more of a scientific type person, I guess, but I believe the Bible. I believe there are angels and demons. I just didn't know what does it look like and stuff. So that paradigm. So what I brought to that discussion, I thought that was a little unique. Was I thought, well, I'm going to be retelling Bible stories, and I'm going to be applying some fiction, but I want to make it consistent with the Bible. But I thought, well, what if the gods of the ancient world? We know that these various gods, whether it's Osiris and Isis and Set in Egypt, or in Canaan, it's Baal and Asherah, right? What if these gods and goddesses of the ancient world, what if there was some demonic reality behind them, And sure enough, the Bible actually suggests that, at least in Deuteronomy 32. You read further on down, it talks about how the Canaanite, or when Israelites worshipped Canaanite gods, they sacrificed to demons. And it's like, oh, so there's some, whatever that looks like, it doesn't reveal, doesn't say exactly, but there's a demonic reality to them. And so so I said, well, what if the gods of the ancient world were these fallen watchers over the nations, right? It would make sense because, they would masquerade as gods and draw worship away from Yahweh. So that was sort of the premise of all the books I've been writing. I have 3 series: Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and Chronicles of the Watchers. All of them, you can line them all up, find out, what stories there are, and they all interweave with each other because I just have different series because they're kind of focusing on different topics or whatever. And so the latest is Chronicles of the Watchers, and the latest novel, Moses Against the Gods of Egypt. And what inspired me to write that, even though I wrote the Chronicles of Nephilim, and I'm going back and inserting Moses, it kind of fits in there before Joshua Valiant in my series, my Nephilim series. Mm-hmm. But the reason why was because I went back to it, I realized, Exodus 12:12 does say that Yahweh says, I'm going to judge the gods of Egypt. And I thought, that really fits this watcher paradigm, right? If these gods are over them. And so I thought, what would that look like in the spiritual realm? So the idea here was like, so when God is, and he said that in relation to the plagues. So it's like, what is that like if God's judging Egypt with these plagues? What does it look like in the spiritual realm with these watchers? And, and that's what got me going and got me inspired. And so the Moses novel tries to, I try to tell a story of what it might look like in the spiritual realm while the plagues are coming down on the land. Of course, it's more than that. It's the whole story of Moses, but that's sort of the principle of that. And even the plagues themselves were something that kind of always struck me. Like, there's been different theories about what was going on with the plagues and what God meant by that, right? And of course, one of the statements is the argument that, well, Egypt had hundreds of gods and they had gods of everything. They had a god of frogs, a god of locusts, a god of this and god of that. So, each one of the plagues is addressing one of these gods. But I don't think that fits. And the reason why is because not all the plagues do fit gods. Like, okay, Ra is the sun god. Sun was, everything was black for 3 days or whatever. That's legit. I can see that. I can see the Nile, the first one, right? There's a god of the Nile. But there are some of the plagues like hail or what have you that don't really fit with any gods. And the other thing is the ones that they say fit, like the frog goddess, Heket. Well, actually, and the locust god, Sekhmet or Senhem. The problem is they're minor deities that of no consequence. Like there's nothing that fits Isis and Osiris, the major gods of, and Set. Well, Set does, but so I was thinking, well, what does that mean then? How does that work? It doesn't really make sense. And as I studied the pantheon and the mythology of Egypt, I came to realize that their picture of the gods was like a unified ecosystem. There isn't just a god of locust. He had other things that he was god of. He did other things, and so there just happened to be one thing, right? And so what the reality is that all the gods have multiple overlapping responsibilities. And for example, in my companion book where I provide my biblical research called The Spiritual World of Moses, I write about how all the gods that I found, if I went through each of the 10 plagues, I found about 10 to 20 gods related to each of the plagues, because there are like 20 gods that related to the Nile. Like, for instance, you might say, well, Hapi, he was the god of the Nile. Well, actually, he was the god of the inundation or the flooding of the Nile. There was also a guardian god of the Nile named Khnum. There's also, the Nile was the bloodstream of Osiris. So there's many gods related to the Nile. So what I came to the conclusion was the Egyptian worldview was that the pantheon of gods all work together in this ecosystem, so to speak, which is nature or whatever. At that time, they didn't call it nature, but it was the natural world around them that provided their life and sustenance. And so that's the gods were responsible for creating that and sustaining it. So what God was doing actually was not so much judging single gods. He was taking key elements of creation and returning them to chaos, right? The blood Nile, all that, the diseases, all that. He was bringing chaos, and some of those creatures weren't like flies. There's no god of flies, but flies were elements of chaos, especially when you have swarms, right? And swarms of pests and all this. Mm-hmm. So God was like deconstructing nature, or he was decreating their creation to show that these gods are nothing and they have no power. God, Yahweh, is the God of all this creation that you worship, not your gods. I'm the one who has the power, and I'm going to return it to chaos. And so it's a theological kind of concept, but then also think about it. Then out of that chaos, he draws his people through the parts the Red Seas, and that's element of chaos, to bring them to Sinai to give him his covenant order. So there's this ancient notion in all religions and in the Hebrew Bible as well, this theme of order versus chaos. And God is reducing the Egyptian pantheon to chaos and their creation to chaos, because he's going to create a new people at Sinai, and it's his creation, right? And so he creates the world anew, so to speak, metaphorically, and all this. So that was the concept that I found so fascinating that I wanted to incorporate as I'm retelling Moses' story as well. And there's a whole lot of fascinating stuff about Moses that was very enlightening to me.
I'm sure. So now I've got to ask, because you started writing these stories around the Noah movie and all that kind of stuff. So do you have rock monsters in your stories?
Yeah, well, that was the one thing I discovered when the movie came out. I went, he doesn't have any of my cool things that I have, and his stuff is stupid. So I'm like, yeah.
Well, that's funny because, you say in your book that it's a fully biblical and fully researched retelling of the story. But it is very different than, what I would have received, growing up in my little independent fundamental Baptist church, growing up in Colorado, and the flannel graph stories that I had growing up, or, going and studying in Bible college or anything like that. So, why is this so different? And why aren't we hearing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not a liberal who's trying to say, oh, the Bible's all wrong and this is what it really means, right, or anything like that. So my goal is to seek to understand the text within its ancient Near Eastern context, within its ancient context. And my premise is, when we read the Bible, and we bring to it our own assumptions. In other words, I just read the Bible, I just read it for what it says, and I believe it. Well, when you do that, what you don't realize is you're bringing your own cultural biases and understandings of something that has a different context and meaning within an ancient world. And so not everything, but there's many things that does take place. And so, when you do research to find out what did the Leviathan mean, in the ancient world, because Leviathan shows up in a lot of, he's one of my favorite creatures. He's in all my novels, but he's this sea dragon monster and who has multiple heads, by the way. Psalm 74, read it yourself. He has multiple heads. And, so many people read that and think, well, the Bible, whatever the Bible says, so it's a dinosaur. It must be a dinosaur. And it's like, well, yeah, this is an example of what I'm saying is when you're assuming that the Bible is going to be scientifically literate and precise, it's like, no, that's not how they thought back then. And then when you research other surrounding nations and you find, oh, they had a Leviathan too. Canaan had a Leviathan too. What did it mean to them? And then you go back in the Bible and go, oh, I see similar language in the Bible. And what you come up with is, no, it's not something literal that they believed in. They use poetic language to describe the theology behind what was happening historically. So in Psalm 74, when you read God parts the Red Sea and walks his people through, he crushes the heads of Leviathan. Well, is that just say, he crushes sea monsters' heads? No, there's so much more to it than that. You do a study of Leviathan, and I have a new book out called Leviathan and Behemoth, where I do the Bible study on that. But what you find is it's a deliberate mythological construct. There's that scary word again, mythology. Right. It's a symbolic construct. That's all it means. It's a symbolic construct.
Poetic language.
But it means something to them. And it basically means they use this knowingly to describe chaos. Mm-hmm. The sea dragon of chaos in the ocean, seas were considered chaos too, because of the dark and the deep. They didn't know what was there. And the idea is that, and all nations believe this, but they believe that Yahweh was pushing back the chaos or trampling over the chaos, however you want to term to describe it. He's pushing it back to create his covenanted order. And he does that in Sinai. So Psalm 74 is saying that. Mm-hmm. And it's talking about the historical incident of the crossing of the Red Sea, but it uses a lot of poetic imagery to describe the spiritual meaning to it. So I'm convinced that Leviathan is a spiritual symbol in the Bible, used many times, often of Egypt, by the way, or to reference that kind of thing. But the idea is that the chaos that God suppresses in order to create his order. And what's his order? His covenant with his people. He pulls them out of the chaos of Egypt to create his covenanted order. And so that's what I mean when I say, you don't just read, Leviathan, well, it must be a dinosaur, because it's literal. It's like, no, what's the context and where else is it used? And you can draw some understanding from the surrounding cultures because they have something similar. And now I know Christians are oftentimes afraid of doing that because they believe that, then you're turning the Bible into pagan literature as if, but they had a different view, Well, yeah, there's differences and similarities. So yes, the Jews used Leviathan, which was the same word Leviathan in Canaanite culture, but they believe Baal destroyed Leviathan. So what they're doing is they're saying, no, Baal isn't the storm god who creates order out of chaos, because that's what Canaanite said. Our God Yahweh is. That was just their way of saying that, right? And so I find a lot of these things, and as I research, I want to put them in my novel because they're kind of cool. And so what I do is I use those elements like Leviathan and various other watchers and stuff. They're in the spiritual realm, and that's where you're speculative. Can't avoid it. But I'm trying to say, what might it look like in the spiritual realm that we don't see that would express this theological truth? And that's where we need to understand the ancient context, because so many things that are written are not readily apparent to us if we just interpret it through our scientific, precise eyes. Another example, and I've talked about this before, is, the collapsing universe imagery, or one of my favorite ones, and I think it's Jeremiah 4, where it talks about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC. when Babylon came and destroyed it.
Mm-hmm.
And it describes it. And you read that passage and it says, all is returned to tohu wabohu, walvohu, which is it's the Genesis phrase of void and empty, right? Mm-hmm. So and then it describes that there's no man on the earth, there's no bird on the. It's describing a return to chaos. When, in other words, when the temple, God's structure of His holy order, is destroyed, it's like returning the earth to chaos. That's the concept, because it is their order. Their cosmos is rooted in the covenant, which is expressed in the temple. So they're using those terms as if we're returning to chaos. Well, that's what I think also is kind of happening with the Egypt episode. God's returning, but He's returning Egypt to chaos so He can draw His people out, right? So yeah, that's my context, of why I'm approaching it from that perspective.
One of the first rules of understanding any ancient writing, it doesn't matter if it's Homer's Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Art of War, and of course the Bible, is that we have to remember that these texts weren't written to us. They were written to ancient people living in ancient cultures with a very different context. And yes, this still applies to those of us who believe that the Bible is more than just an ancient document. While the Bible may be written for us, meaning it applies to our lives in our context today, it wasn't written to us. And if our interpretation of the Bible doesn't fit within its ancient context, it's probably a bad interpretation. I want to take just a minute to encourage you to check out this episode's sponsor, the Hero's Journal. We began a quest to better ourselves and our lives through this amazing tool that uses the power of stories and scientifically proven productivity techniques to help fans like us take control of the story that we tell ourselves. Changing our story takes small changes over a period of time. It's not great moments of inspiration. It's the small, consistent actions. And the Hero's Journal provides a fun and powerful way of taking those steps. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking a lot more about the Hero's Journal. But if you want to take your first steps now, go to theheroesjournal.co to learn more. That's theheroesjournal.co. And if you haven't checked out our Patreon page, I want to make sure that you head over there after listening to this episode, because you're probably unaware that we regularly post public content on our page. That means you don't have to be a Patreon supporter to read it. And one of the things that gets put on that page just about every day is a new Dad Moments article in a series of these stories that I'm writing. These articles take ideas from the stories that we love, and then it looks at them from the greater story perspective that you've come to know Tatooine Sons for. And last week I posted an article on there about why all of these epic stories seem to have dragons in them. I asked Brian to continue his thoughts on Leviathan from the Bible, especially whether that has to do with this great dragon of the Revelation.
In fact, in my series, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, I do that. And I think very clearly that, and look, that's an example where I would assume almost everybody agrees that the dragon, there's two beasts, a land beast and a sea beast, but everyone would agree that sea beast is a symbol. I mean, maybe there's someone who believes there's going to be a Godzilla that rises up, but I don't know.
It's easy to make that more symbolic, right?
Yeah. Most people would agree. And I think literally, John's drawing from his heritage. Why wouldn't he? Because if you look, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but Revelation, there are whole books written about the hundreds of references in Revelation to ancient or to Old Testament symbols and images from out of the prophets, right? So it's very, John draws a lot from Ezekiel and he repurposes it for his own usage, right? So the seven-headed dragon in Revelation is the beast that represents the monster government of chaos that's fighting God. And why wouldn't he be the culmination of the Leviathan from all of history that they've used? Why wouldn't he be, right? But it's interesting to note that those seven heads, the Canaanite Leviathan had 7 heads. And like I mentioned, in Psalm 74, it says that Leviathan has multiple heads. Now, it doesn't say how many in the Bible, but I think that 7 is a common reference. But it doesn't have to be literally 7. I don't think so. But it's great that fits because John refers to those 7 heads as 7 kings and such, which is perfect for historically speaking. But he absolutely is drawing from those images. In fact, in my book, I even think the land beast. So this gets into Behemoth. Leviathan's the sea dragon. Behemoth is more of a land beast. Now, some people think it's a hippopotamus or a crocodile, but it's not. But they do notice that it lays in the rivers. But it still is. It's a beast that can be on land. And traditionally, in Second Temple Jewish literature, they understood and extrapolated that to be the land beast versus the sea beast. And they were both chaos monsters, right? For different elements. But this is why at the end of Revelation, there's the wedding feast of the Lamb, and it talks about how the beast is thrown in the lake of fire. So because he's thrown like a fire, you don't have them eating the beast. But normally in the Second Temple literature and in Psalms, it talks about you're going to eat the beast. I'm going to kill the sea dragon Leviathan, and you're going to eat him in the desert, right? And the Second Temple literature says that. But they combine both of them. They say Behemoth and Leviathan will both be destroyed and eaten. And then in Revelation, if you think about it, the armies of the beast represent his earthly body, so to speak, and they are eaten by the birds. So there's this banquet feast imagery that's always tied with these chaos monsters. And I think that John is drawing from Behemoth and Leviathan to sort of wrap that together. Absolutely.
Wow. So, you've been writing these stories and communicating with this worldview for, what is it, over 10 years now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm assuming, based on my experience with this worldview and sharing this at times, that sometimes people are very reluctant to kind of accept this supernatural worldview. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I haven't gotten a lot of reluctance. I thought I was going to be attacked for it when I first came out with it, because I thought Christians would be saying, you're playing with the word of God, because of their misunderstanding. And that's common. But it comes from, a good place of desiring to honor God. I get that. But I was expecting I was going to get in trouble. I didn't know it would become a best-selling series, right? So the truth is I think there's a wave of acceptance that it's just growing, and it's powerful. However, there are people who don't. And I have encountered a few people, and, they tend to also be people who just don't, they don't want this. They don't want too much of the supernatural component. They believe in the supernatural, but like myself in the past, it scares them when it sounds like other mythology, pagan mythology, or it sounds like something that's just so supernatural that it's hard to believe. Like Genesis 6, when sons of God, angels have sex with humans. That just sounds so wild to people.
Yeah, and it doesn't help when you have teachers that go on television and talk about their husbands being, those types of things. And in our world, we've heard a lot of people joking about that kind of stuff. So.
Yes, exactly. I know. That's why I'm like, I'm in this world, and I'm not as one of the extremists. In fact, sometimes I find myself feeling a little out of place in some of the discussions with people because they're really into the wacky stuff, and then they take it on, and then the end times and the Nephilim are going to come back and all this stuff. I don't believe any of that. So, you're right. There is some absolutely. There's some nuttiness that is attached to it. I can't deny that. But again, it's like, I've always the only. In fact, that's the only reason why I believe angels had sex with humans is because I believe the Bible says it, and I can't escape it, and I'm not gonna change it. Now, if it didn't say that, fine. But as I studied, I didn't escape the fact that that's what it's saying, and I still don't want to believe it because it sounds mythological to me, right? But my premise has always been what the Bible says is true, not what I think is true, or not what doesn't make sense to me, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. And so consequently, I'm a reluctant convert myself. So I kind of feel I do appreciate the other side. And I've interacted sometimes with people like that. And I have some friends I have highly respect who believe a non-supernatural interpretation of these things, So yeah, and that's fine. But in my books, I usually try to answer that biblically and theologically. When I have my Bible research books that go along, so like you've got When Giants Were Upon the Earth, that sort of is the first book of all my works explaining the Nephilim, the Watchers, the sons of God, the weird things in the Bible. And then When Watchers Ruled the Nations is the second part. And these are all drawn from the research that I've done for my novel series. That's where I try to address the doubts and the people who might say, oh, the sons of God are just human kings or human judges, And it's like, no. Biblically, you can't make that argument. Therefore, it's like, therefore, it's that wild interpretation, like, oh my gosh, a man really did rise from the dead. I have to believe that. I guess I will.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Now, you say in your book that, or you connect in your book the idea of things that are happening in this physical realm, which in Moses, they're happening in the spiritual realm, and you tie it in a lot of ways to spiritual warfare. Yes. With that, kind of explain a little bit more what you mean by that.
And that's another thing that I know today. There's a whole movement called spiritual warfare movement, and I'm really not in it, to be honest. Right. I'm really not. But I think they, but this is the thing with all cults as well, right? There's always some truth to every cult, where they find some little truth that's been neglected, and then they create a false, narrative around it, right? Mm-hmm. And so the spiritual warfare notion is just this notion that, as I mentioned, that these there are watchers over, there are territorial principalities and powers over the nations, over the earthly authorities, and that's the thing that even today they'll say, yeah, there are still today, But in my storyline of all my novels, I pretty much prove that, biblically speaking, no, actually, when Messiah came, he ended that spiritual warfare, because those principalities and powers who were over the nations are no longer over the nations. They've been disinherited, because as Psalm 82 says, when God arises, resurrects, right? Mm-hmm. He's going to inherit the nations. Well, those nations who were under the authorities of the Watchers, when Messiah comes and dies for sins and he disinherits those nations from the Watchers, because the Gentiles were in ignorance, right? Now that frees up the Gentiles to be able to become into the kingdom of God. And then the gospel is preached. And then what does it say? Men and women from all tribes and nations and tongues and world. Well, that wasn't true before. Why? Right. Because the nations were in bondage to these Watchers. But once Messiah comes, he destroys that. And that's the beauty and power of the gospel that is really rooted in my whole storyline, that I'm kind of like, that's where I differ from that modern spiritual warfare movement. But just because, just because there's a lot of kookiness in there, doesn't mean that everything they say is wrong. Just like, just because a Mormon might believe in the divine council, that doesn't mean it's wrong, Right. Catholics believe in the Trinity. Does that make the Trinity wrong? Of course, if there are Catholics listening, I'm speaking as a Protestant, knowing that there are Protestants who think that way, right? So I'm just giving those examples. But it's I enjoy the controversy, though. It's really been fun to work through all these controversies. So, for example, in my Moses novel, one of the big controversies is precisely the historicity of Moses. Mm. And what happened is, decades ago, the traditional viewpoint of the Exodus was that it occurred in 1447 BC. And that was roughly taken from Kings, the book of Kings, where it describes that, Solomon built his temple 480 years after the Exodus. And we know when Solomon roughly built his temple, you go back 480 years, and it's 1447 BC. But that's the traditional view. But then as things change and scholars and academia changes, the popular view became that no, it actually happened under Ramses in 1250 BC. That was the view that then the movie The Ten Commandments was rooted in. That's why we saw Ramses, and that was an awesome movie. And I love Yul Brynner and I love Charlton Heston, but it's really not. I don't believe it's accurate. But that particular controversy was so once you accept that, and a lot of Bible believing Christians started to believe that too. But the problem is once you accept that, all of a sudden, there's no evidence for Moses and Jews in the Egypt, and there's no evidence for the Exodus. Why? Because the evidence that was there did not occur at that time period. Example, in where the Bible calls Goshen in Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt in the north, the land of Goshen, it was in the Delta, and they found, decades ago, they found the city of Varus. And that's actually where Pi Ramses was, where they call it Pi Ramses in the Bible. And that's where the Jews were. And they've done archaeological expeditions and have found various layers. And there is a layer where it is loaded with Semites, and Jews are Semites. Mm-hmm. And so, lots of them, right? But the problem is that occurs several hundred years before 1250. At the archaeological level of 1250, there's no Semites.
Right.
So that's why they say there's no evidence of it, right? But the evidence is 300 years earlier, which comes to around 1447 BC, which ironically, that's exactly when the Bible says the Jews were there in Egypt, and there is evidence. It's just they're shifting the dates so you don't see it. And the other real strong one of that is when Joshua conquers Canaan, right? He takes out Jericho, and then Hazor and all these other fortified towns. Well, modern archaeology has concluded that there were no fortified towns in 1250 BC. They were all destroyed hundreds of years earlier. Jericho wasn't even inhabited. So there's your lack of evidence, except when the Jericho was destroyed was several hundred years earlier, which is roughly around 1440 BC or 1400 BC, where the traditional view says. So there is evidence. It's just that over the years, people, and even Bible believing Christians, have adopted the new popular view, and there's amazing how much evidence there is for the old traditional view. By the way, now is when I want to recommend a major documentary series that influenced my writing of Moses, and that was Patterns of Evidence. There's 4 documentaries. I recommend watching them all. You can find it online, or some of them are on Amazon for cheap rental, but you can get the website. Patterns of Evidence. The Exodus is the first one, and it's just phenomenal. And it really goes through all the views, all the controversies, and it comes out supporting the biblical view. But it's not absolute. He recognizes, well, there's not agreement on all this, but here's some possibilities. I highly recommend it if you love the whole issue of is Moses and the Jews in Egypt, is it historical? Is there archaeological evidence? All that stuff, because he really goes through that. And so I rooted a lot of my chronological timeline on that similar research, not just that documentary, but another Egyptologist named David Rohl, who, I'm not going to go into all the details, but suffice it to say that Egyptian chronology, ancient Egyptian chronology, is a mess. If you read it, if you study it, you realize there's no certainty on the dates, and there's all different varieties of when these pharaohs lived and such. And there's a school called the New Chronology that David Rohl is a part of, and it shifts things around to be more accurate according to their view. And the short of it is that not only is now there are different views about when was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? And even within Christian believers, and they're all legitimate possibilities. Thutmose, Amenhotep, I think, the second, I think. There's several. Why? Because they think that they were the ones around in the time of 1447, right? But they're not certain about the dating. So there's varieties of interpretations. However, and not Ramses, in other words. However, according to David Rohl's New Chronology, he concludes that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Dudamos, a lesser known Pharaoh, but there is evidence of him, and there's even possible evidence archaeologically of Moses with with a name that is very similar to Moses and could very well have been his Egyptian name. So there's some amazing material that, and the documentaries deal with some of it. Or if you want to read more of it, get David Roll's book, Exodus, Myth or History. It's fantastic. It'll change your world. Now, there's even differences within Christians about that, but I'm a novelist. I found it fascinating. So I wanted to write, and no one's done this before, so I want to write a novel where Dudamos is the Exodus, and I'm drawing from ancient legends and historians who have some references to Dudamos, and I'm drawing from other texts like Josephus, and I've even drawing from some legends about Moses that are not in the Bible, but ancient Jewish historians actually suggest, and they had access to earlier materials that have been destroyed. So we're not sure how true it might be, but I incorporate all that stuff into my novels because I don't want to make stuff up. I want to draw from the ancient world, you know? And so, for example, I have a story of Moses where he was a general in the Pharaoh's army and he conquers the land of Cush. Cush was south of them, and it was Ethiopians, and so they're black, and they always had battles with Egypt. Well, he conquers them, and there's a story that goes that Moses then surrounded the city, and the princess of the city saw him and fell in love with him, and they offered surrender of the city under the condition that he would marry the princess, which was a common thing to do in the ancient world, right? And so that means he married a black princess, right? But these are things I draw in because maybe that makes some sense of some of these other strange Bible passages, like the one verse in Numbers that says Miriam and Aaron were mad at Moses because he married a Cushite woman.
Right.
Cushite woman was black. That's the only place it says it. Zipporah, his only wife that's mentioned, is a Midianite, not a Cushite. Now, she could be a Cushite because the Midianites are traders, maybe he intermarried, who knows? But the point is these are some of the things that I try to draw together from multiple theories to make as much fit as possible within the biblical realm. And it's just amazing the things you discover when you go deeper. And, and Moses too. That's another, Moses himself. One of the things I bring in, I love Charlton Heston, but I'm sorry, but the biblical Moses was not that strong. That booming voice, let my people go. When you read closely Exodus, you find that Moses had a stuttering problem. And it talks about him himself. He himself says that to Yahweh, I'm slow of speech. I'm uncircumcised of lips. This was all language that if you look elsewhere in the Bible, it means stuttering. And so I have a stuttering Moses, and but what does that do when you're seeing it through new eyes, but it's still biblical, and you start to see from a different perspective, one of which is as great of a leader men can be, absolutely. When we realize they're more weaker than we realize, then God is glorified more. And so I believe that my story shows that, Moses did great things, but he was a weak, frail sinner just like you and me, believe it or not. We can actually get inspired by the fact that God uses weak vessels. So that allows us the ability to connect and relate to Bible heroes that we otherwise have tended to see as beyond us, right? Like Moses on the mountain or Elijah, right? In fact, I've noticed this with all my books. When I research into these characters, I find out their weaknesses and their frailties. I think Moses had an anger problem too. And here's another thing too, that one of the themes that I addressed in the novel was Moses struggling with fatherhood. Like, think about this. He's a man who never had a real consistent father in his life. His own father gave him up to save him, but he gave him away. We don't read anything about his father. And then he becomes son to Pharaoh. He thinks he's the Pharaoh's high son, but then he realizes he's not. And then he's a lowly slave, son of a lowly slave. And then the Pharaoh tries to kill him. His own father tries to kill him, right? Then he flees to Midian and he finds a new father figure in Jethro, which is good, but then he has to leave him and go back. So so all this, like, he never had that consistent fathering. But I think one of the elements of it is God is his father, of course. And maybe that's part of his own spiritual journey, is learning that God is the father he never could have on earth, and that he gets comfort from that. And don't we all struggle with that to some degree, right? So these are the things that make him more human, but also biblical. So it's not like I'm making, it's not like the Last Temptation of Christ. Let's make Jesus into a sinner so that we can relate to him. No. But it's like, this is realizing, well, actually it's really there in the Bible, but our own propensity to create legends, or, we glom on to something like the Ten Commandments movie. It was so good that most people think when they remember things from the Moses story, they're remembering it from there, whether they know it or not. And there's a lot in there that's not quite accurate. So and look, even though I'm trying to quote, be more biblical in that sense, I too am using fiction. I'm filling in the holes because there's a lot of holes in Moses' story, right? We hear a story about his birth, then a story about 40 years later when he murders the Egyptian, then 40 years later when he's in Midian and gets the call. So there's really not, in 120 years, there's not much about him. So I'm trying to fill in those gaps, but make it consistent. And that's the fun of fiction, as long as it drives that same sort of biblical theological theme and motif that I think is in there, and that one of those major themes, at least for Moses, is our weakness and utter reliance upon God and how he is our strength.
Brian touches on an idea that I've really been trying to embrace personally over the last few months. I don't have to have it all figured out. I'm incapable of being strong enough on my own, and I don't have to solve all of the world's problems. That's actually one of the most hopeful things that we have as Christians. We have a Father. He is the God of heaven and earth, and his strength is actually made perfect in our weakness. I want to thank Brian for joining me on this week's interview show. Brian's website is where you can find everything that you could dream of regarding the Supernatural Worldview and his Chronicles series and all of his screenwriting work. Check out Godawa.com. That's Godawa.com to learn more. And thank you for listening to Tatooine Sons, a pop culture podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your podcast app that you're listening to us on. Make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on there as well, so you get every episode the moment that it drops. Our next episode releases on Tuesday. I'm not sure where we're going to go with that episode. We're in that weird dead space before Moon Knight comes out. But I'm sure we're going to probably have some Superman and Lois on there. Maybe we'll get a Thor Love and Thunder trailer. There's some rumors about that. Hopefully that will drop. Who knows? Make sure you follow the show, though, so you don't miss that episode or any other future episode. While you're at it, follow the Tatooine Sons on Facebook and Twitter. Share this episode with somebody else. Please do that. It's the best way you help this show grow. That's going to do it for today. There's only one thing left to say.
May the Force be with you, always.
This party's over.
I like that Wookiee.
Don't get technical with me.
Joy, please.
Yep, yep.